Today's webinar, How Can Predictive Analytics Enable On-the-Job Performance? In this session, Chris Littlewood, Filtered's co-founder and head of science, will discuss how analytical techniques can transform online training. Before we get started, just a quick word about Filtered. We are an e-learning company specializing in the use of adaptive technologies to accelerate learning and reduce training time. We won't teach you everything, just what you need to learn. So check out filtered.com to see our full range of courses. In today's event, you can submit text questions to Chris by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You can send in questions at any time, and we will address them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. If you experience any technical difficulties, please let us know via the question pane, and the admin team will do their very best to address them. I'd now like to introduce Chris Littlewood. Chris, I'm going to pass things over to you.
Thanks very much, Inga, and hello everybody. Thanks a lot for joining us today. As Inga said, I work here at Filtered in London as part of the data science team. I'm the head of science here. And as Inga also said in that introduction, we do predictive analytics in order to personalize our courses, by which we just mean that we use data that we gather from users and usage of our courses to give them a course that's appropriate to them. So today, what we wanted to talk about was how you can use those predictive techniques to turn online training into something much more powerful, to turn online training into a performance support tool. So this is a version of a talk that I gave with my colleague Nick Fernando at the Learning Live event, which was run in London last week. Nick, I'm afraid, has content duties to attend to, but I'm going to try and do some justice to his material too. And keep the talk together. So what I'm going to do first of all is talk about where we're coming from, what we mean by using predictive analytics in this way to make a performance support tool out of online training. Then I'm going to talk about some challenges that need to be overcome in order to do that. And then finally, I'm going to come back and talk about enablers and some things that actually address those challenges and enable performance support through online learning. So to start with where we're coming from, what am I talking about when it's quite a complex title. So this will be, I think, a familiar training model to many of you. So this is the idea that it's a sort of slightly counterintuitive idea, I guess, at first, that most of our learning is not done through training, not done in a formal way, but it's done through tough jobs. That's the 70%. So learning through doing, and particularly learning through doing things that are hard. 20% of learning coming from people, from social learning, so that's your colleagues or your boss. And only 10% of learning by effective managers, effective people coming from courses and formal training. So it's presented in this order, 70-20-10 traditionally. It's if you search for any learning blogs, then this will pop up. It's promoted by, among others, Charles Jennings. He's a big proponent of its application within business organizations. And it's presented in this 70-20-10 way, I guess, to emphasize the 70, to emphasize the slightly counterintuitive element to it, that 70, this big proportion is actually not done in the training room, it's done on the job at the desk. But this doesn't really leave much room for the course. So we've got this 70-20-10, and where's the course? Well, it's relegated to this 10%. And I think what we want to argue today, and what we think generally, is that although it might be 10% of time spent on formal learning, that this is still a really important bit. So it's and I think I'll try and explain later in the presentation why that is, why that 10% really is important, even though it perhaps doesn't dominate in terms of time spent of learning. So 70-20-10 is the familiar way in which this is presented. perhaps a more logical order to think about it in terms of the way we acquire skills is in this way, with the 10 leading. And so as soon as a training need is acknowledged, then often there'll be some sort of formal learning, whether that's from books or courses or whatever. And so I think it's this order that makes a bit more sense when we're trying to think of the order in which training is consumed. 70, 20, 10 might well be the sensible order when you're thinking about sort of relative importance, of course. So what we're going to argue is that this 10%, while it's small, is key. And the way to make continuous learning effective, the way to turn formal training into a performance support tool, is to try and blur this boundary between the formal training and its application, and to integrate effectively the formal learning with its application afterwards on tough jobs, and the social learning aspects where teachers within your organisation can reinforce what you want to learn. So if we want to do this thing, if we want to make continuous learning really effective, to use this model of 70, 20, 10, which is resonates with people and which is sort of widely accepted now as a sensible methodology to try and think about training as a whole. If we want to use continuous learning in this way, then we've got some challenges. I just want to set those out first of all. So the first challenge when you're talking about continuous learning as opposed to sort of traditional classroom-based learning, for instance, is one of framing. So when you're seeking to learn substantially on the job or from other people, then context isn't always really clear. So the learner often isn't fully clear what they need to know, and the competencies and tasks don't come sort of nicely packaged in a course. They arrived at as they're encountered on the job. And so it makes it difficult for learners to build a robust mental model, whereas of course, when you're in a formal learning situation, then you can be presented with a clean mental model. So that's the first challenge I wanted to talk about, framing. The second challenge is to do with relevance. So this is about, so if you've got these separate modes of learning, you've got formal learning and then you've got learning on the job, then those aren't necessarily going to be the same shape. The way in which the training is presented in the formal environment might well differ from the way in which it's encountered in task-based and in social learning. So the informal learning is by definition unstructured, and so it's tricky to pick out those relevant bits that are going to be applied later. I think also, with task-based learning, you can't guarantee that the concepts that are necessary are going to get covered in any given time frame. It relies on the work consisting of tasks that are useful in terms of developing those skills within the individual. So this relevance is a big challenge, that the training content, the thing being studied, needs to be there in the tasks in order to be studied, and it needs to be relevant in the formal element of the training in order to stick. And then the last challenge is skill decay. So if relevance is about the formal phase of the learning linking to the task-based stage because the stuff being taught formally is relevant, then skill decay is similar in that if there's no chance to apply the skills being learned after the formal phase, if you go back to your job and there's no opportunity to apply the skills, then your skills start to decay and you start to lose the proficiency that you've gained. So those are the three challenges, I think, three important challenges to continuous learning, make it more difficult to deliver effectively than formal training. I want to just try and paint a picture of how those things fit together in this sort of stylized view of how someone learns. So what we have here is a graph which is showing time along the horizontal axis and the proficiency of the learner that's being developed on the vertical axis. So what we have here is at the start of a course, at the start of some training, then before training begins, then we're at a particular level of proficiency. But when we start some training, then often there can be a drop in proficiency at the start, and that's so the famous analogy there is with golf, with learning to drive a golf ball. So if you want to really improve, if you want to become great at golf, then generally you'll have to unlearn the bad habits that you might have learned, the things that aren't consistent with the sort of way that you want to drive when you become truly proficient. So in that unlearning phase, then you become less adept at applying it. So there's an unlearning phase during the training. Then, hopefully, if the training is effective, then there's this climb, this blue line is climbing towards the end of the training. But then, when it comes to when you finish the course and you hit this, you're ready to go back and apply it on the job, then the relevance comes into question. So when you're back on the job, if it's relevant, then you get a chance to continue applying it using that task-based learning, and you can follow this dotted red line. You can continue to improve your performance beyond where you were from the formal phase. But if there's no relevant tasks to hand, first of all, then you might see you'll plateau, and eventually, when it comes to realizing value, then your skills will start to decay. So this is where these three sort of challenges fit in terms of the overall picture of learning. So we've got a framing problem at the start where if we can set out the concepts in a consistent and structured way, then that unlearning phase can be less painful. That you can get where the new information is fitting. That you can process it better. Then there's a relevant point of continuing the learning immediately after provision of the training so that you start to build on what you've learned in the formal phase through task. And then finally, the skill decay point, unless there's opportunity on the job to apply those skills, then they'll start to decay. So that's what I wanted to say about the challenges. Hopefully I've given an idea of why it might be a bit difficult to do continuous learning in an effective way. And now I want to get onto the phase of the presentation which really talks about why predictive analytics can make a difference to this problem. So what I'm going to do is go through each of those three challenges and outline an enabler that I think meets head-on the challenge and overcomes it. So the first challenge, you remember, was framing. So this was the idea that when we're learning something new, we're in unfamiliar territory. We don't know where the concepts fit. We don't know what we need to know. We don't know what we don't know. But in a continuous learning framework, then the focus of this formal phase can be on orientation. We can say in this formal phase of training, we know that further down the line we're going to be applying these new skills to tasks. We're going to be learning from our colleagues, and so this phase of the presentation isn't about learning everything. This is just about building myself a mental model into which all my subsequent learning can slot. So what do we mean by a mental model? What does that look like? So it's three things really. It's what the concepts are. What are the key concepts really? Why are they important? Which is often related to sort of how they can be applied. So why is it that each of those concepts is important? Why are they necessary to learn? And then the third one is how do they fit together? How do they relate to each other? And that together, those things form a sort of scaffold into which you can slot subsequent learning. I have an example from that's been with me through my career, and that is when I was at school doing maths and trying to learn logarithms, then I found them really difficult. And I remember something that my maths teacher told me, which was, he said, "Chris, you just need to make friends with logarithms." And what he meant by that, I think, was learning something new for the first time. You should treat that like making a new acquaintance, making an acquaintance with a potential friend. So you're not in that first meeting seeking to learn everything about them. You don't need to understand the subject in total. What you really need to do is understand what they're like, what they're about in essence. What are your points of connection? How do they, fit into your world? What have you got in common? And I think that's exactly the sort of approach you need when you're building a mental model. You need to approach a new subject with a view to becoming friends with it, and with a view to sort of forming those points of connection, such that you can sort of cement that friendship over years through application and shared experience. So you need a scaffold. That's the first enabler. How do you acquire that practically? So one way is with a course. So might sound a bit trite, but of course there are lots of benefits from taking a course. But imagine now I want to learn data science. So I could do a data science course, but what I could also do is go to a data science course and use that, treat that intelligently from the point of view of trying to build my own mental framework. So any course that I look at is going to have a table of contents. It's going to have a structure, some of which is going to be familiar to me. So I can use that table of contents. I can use the things that are familiar to me. I can use the dependencies that are apparent. I can dive into bits of the training that look interesting or relevant. And I can use that from the point of view of building this mental model. So I'm not trying to follow the whole course, but perhaps I'm simply trying to understand what are the key concepts that are relevant to me, and how do they fit together. So that's one way, just consuming traditional training material intelligently from a point of view of trying to build concepts. The other way is just more general research. So this example is saying Wikipedia. I'm not going to become a data scientist by reading the Wikipedia page, but what I will get from that is a sort of crowdsourced, I guess, view of what's important. So I get, similarly, just as with the table of contents, I've got a sort of hierarchy of the subject here. I've got someone's view on the key areas of importance, why they're important, and how they relate together simply through the structure of the page. That's another way, just general research on the subject, of course. And then this is an example that I like, which is, and I've used myself several times, which is using something like Twitter or LinkedIn. So to explain what I mean, so for example, if I want to learn about data science, I'm new to the subject. On Twitter, I can identify which are the important hashtags. I can identify which of the accounts are saying interesting stuff that resonates with me, that speak to me in a voice that I understand and that I like. So I can personalize the way I learn about data science, the way I build my model. The thing I particularly like about Twitter was two things. One is that the content is multi-sourced, so it's coming from all different points of view. So I'm getting lots of people's opinion. I'm not relying on a single person's account of what's important and what isn't, admittedly at the cost of a little bit of structure. The other point is also that it's a good way of learning things that you don't know that you need. So if I am browsing through the Coursera data science course I showed you, then I'm going to be guided by my own experience and the things that I do know. And so I might be blind to things that are really useful to me, but I don't know about. So Twitter overcomes that to an extent, in that I'm just hearing other people's opinion, and things that are useful to them might be useful to me. I'll come back to that when we talk about what we do in Filtered and how we apply this to performance support. So coming back to Filtered actually straight away to talk about something slightly different. So this is finally as an example of how we might build this scaffold of concepts. So this is what we see in this slide is a couple of screenshots from Filtered. So the top left here, what we're seeing is a set of questions that we're asking of a learner. This learner is looking at the Excel course, and we ask them at the point at which they start their training with us stuff about how important particular characteristic tasks are to them. So in this example, if you read the slide there, then we're asking them how important is it to execute repeated tasks? How important is it to collaborate with others on spreadsheets? So we're building a picture of not just the concept map of Excel as a whole, but the concept map that's appropriate to this individual for the way that they want to apply it. And then if you look at the bottom right screenshot, then what we have here is a grid of modules of one of our Excel course. And the white squares in that grid are things that we are recommending that student to learn. The point here is we're selecting from the content. So their scaffold, the scaffold that they're being asked to learn, is smaller than the whole subject of Excel. It's tailored to them. It's the things that are important to them. To go back to my friend's analogy, it's the sort of points of connection that they're being asked to learn about, so that they can build this mental framework sort of from familiar ground. It's sort of the material that's adjacent to them. It's relevant to them because it's formed of things that are important to them. So that's an example of how you might use our training, and how the predictive analytics bit here is simply taking those questions and turning that into some recommendations. And we'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. So the second challenge that I talked about earlier was relevance, and the enabler here is meeting it head on. It's saying you've got this challenge of relevance. You need content training to be relevant in order for it to stick, and you tackle that with relevant content. But I mean something quite specific by saying relevant content. What I mean here is content directly aimed at the gap between what that individual knows and what they want to achieve in the future. So it's a really narrow, it's a thin gap. It's stuff that they can almost do, but they can't quite do. It's stuff that's built exactly on the things that they're used to doing in their job, but it's that next step towards the thing that they want to become. So if you can do that, if you can find personalized material that's personalized in that way, that is, that it's just taking that first step beyond where you are in terms of proficiency, then it's by definition going to be relevant, because it's going to be applied in the future. It speaks to the individual because it's related to stuff they've already done. It's going to be applied in the future because it's that first step towards what they want to do. So to achieve this, then, it needs to be personalized. So the training needs to be personalized, and you can do that in a number of ways. You could do that as an individual, just yourself. You could do that manually. So if I'm consuming that Coursera course, of course I'll be selective in the way I consume it. I might skim over some modules. I might skip ahead. I might not consume it in a linear way. So there's trainees themselves, learners themselves are going to bring some sort of selection, some sort of personalization to their training. Similarly, even if I'm consuming classroom-based learning, I'm sitting in the class, but my attention is not even. I'm listening to the points that speak to me more carefully. I'm making notes on those points. I'm asking questions about those points. So personalization isn't new. The thing that's new is that you can do this now with predictive analytics. So yes, you can still do that personalization manually, but you can also do it with an algorithm. So I just want to explain how we go about doing that very briefly, and I alluded to it in talking about the gap there between current proficiency and future proficiency. So this schematic shows our approach. So we start with a full course, so all of the modules, these squares in this rectangle are intended to be modules of a course. Then we strip out the things that a learner already knows, so material that they are familiar with, that they're used to applying in their job. And finally, we strip out things that aren't necessary to them, so there'll be material that is only tangentially or not at all relevant to the way that they want to apply the training when they get back to the job. So that gives them a shorter, more relevant course. So it's personalized in this way to make it relevant. So how do we go about doing that? So this is the predictive analytics bit. So this is how the science works. So when we get a new user, as you saw before, then we ask them some questions. So those example questions were about the importance of characteristic tasks to them. But we also asked them about their job role, about how confident they are at those characteristic tasks, and we asked them a suite of multiple choice questions testing their proficiency objectively on the subject. So that builds a profile of the learner. So in this diagram here, you can see we've got this individual. She is about to take a course, and we've got a picture of information, a profile of information about her that's relevant to learning, of course. And we use that profile to identify similar learners from the past, some users of our training who have been through the process in advance. And some of those people will be very similar. Some will be similar only in a particular aspect, and that's all relevant to how we use that information. So we build up not just a set of similar users, but the ways in which they happen to be similar. And then all of those similar users from the past have given us feedback on which bits of the training were useful to them. So we'll know that, for example, in this example, so for this set of similar users, maybe the first module of the training, almost everyone found it to be useful. So it's a pretty good bet that this new user will find that useful also. And then we can do that in a more sophisticated way by just finding users who are similar in a particular aspect, and then giving them the modules that are relevant to that particular aspect. So this is standard predictive analytics. It's how predictive analytics works on Amazon. It's how Google works at its heart. It's how the targeted advertising that we're subjected to on the internet works. And so we're applying a predictive analytics technique to training, and this is the way that we build up this personalized picture that can address the relevance question. So the last challenge that I talked about before was skill decay. So this is about there being a problem when there is a disconnect between the formal learning phase, the sit down 10%, and its application on the job. So if there is that disconnect, then there's the opportunity for skills to start to deteriorate if this stuff doesn't get applied. So part of the answer here is relevance, of course. So if we do what we've just said we were going to do and personalize the training, then it is going to include stuff that is going to be applied. So that's part of it. But there's also some stuff you can do to help performance support on the job. So one of the simplest things you can do is to make sure that the training that's been given, the formal phase of training, is available to the individual when they're seeking to apply it. So that sounds really simple, and it is really simple, but it's just that because if you've consumed some formal training, then that of course will be to an extent familiar to you, and so having that resource available in the same format is really key. And of course that's really easy with online training that's accessed through the cloud. If you're applying it in a desk-based situation, the training is going to be there accessible to you when you want to apply it. There's a few things that we've done with our training to try and take that a little bit of a step further. So the first is that we, for each of our training modules, we have, in addition to the main module, what we call an accelerator, which is simply a real bare bones summary of the concepts and how to apply it. So that when you first get to apply a piece of training that you've done with us, then you can pull up the accelerator for that module, and you can you've got that aid which is in the same format, the same language as you learnt it in, and it can assist you through the task and hopefully embed that training strongly in your mind. The other point, the other thing that we've done is something that's very common with online training, but is worth mentioning, which is to have a search functionality. So if there's search functionality, then of course it's really easy to pull up the piece of training that you consumed perhaps a couple of weeks ago that you're now applying for the first time, and so you can bring that and it can address that skill decay problem, the relevance problem. So to finish off, what I'd like to do is just talk about how we see our training as a whole fitting into this model of continuous learning that I've talked about. So I think where we see ourselves is having taken quite a few steps along this road, and that our product is powerful in this respect in supporting continuous learning. But there are quite a few things we also have planned in the pipeline. Just wanted to explain those. So what this slide is showing is across the top here in the blue band, we've got the sort of standard learner journey through our course, which is perhaps similar to most online learning, with the exception of the filtering that we've talked about. So we've got this typical learner journey. I'll just rattle through it. So at the start of training with us, then the filter needs assessment. Our users answer questions so we can understand a bit about them, so we can build that profile in order to link them to other users. Then we use that information to filter their course, and we present them with their smaller filtered course. Then they can take a test to benchmark their training, their proficiency at the start of the training. Then they work their way through the course at whatever pace suits them through the modules. And finally, at the end of the course, they can take a second test to see how they've improved. So down the bottom of the slide, well, this is what that constitutes the formal 10% of the training. What then happens is that they move into its application, and then we see our product as turning into this performance support tool. And it's here when the search functionality that I talked about comes into play, the accelerators that I talked about come into play. We also have plans, these other items on the slide are in our pipeline for development. And here what we want to do is supplement the training as it stands at the moment with, for instance, recommendations from other courses. So for me, this is partly about putting content in front of users that they don't necessarily know that they need. So it's giving them this sort of nugget, this jewel of information. I think, to me, the best training that I've had, the things that have stuck with me and that have made the most difference to my performance, have always been things I didn't realize I wanted, I didn't realize I knew. If I knew what I needed, then and it was really valuable, then I'd hope that I'd have gone out and done my best to acquire that skill anyway. It's the stuff that you're not certain you need that I think is really powerful. So we want to make training recommendations from across courses instead of within a single course. And we also want to blur this line further between the formal phase of the training and its application through tasks or through social learning. And so that's what some of these other points are about. They're about measuring impact of the formal training further down the line. They're about supplementing the task-based and social phases of learning with more formal content, but really appropriate formal content to the way in which the learner is applying the training, and learner-to-learner interaction, so that we can sort of help support the social element of the training through our product. So thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoyed that. If you'd like to ask any questions, then feel free on the webinar, but also please feel free to email us. So my email address and Nick's, actually, they're both simple. I'm chris@filtered.com. Nick is nick@filtered.com. We're really happy to discuss this or anything that you're interested in talking about. We're interested in what people's opinions are of our product and our approach, and in working on improving it and seeing what how it resonates with people's needs. So please, by all means, get in touch. But I'll thank you very much, and I'll stop there.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you everybody for attending today's webinar on how can predictive analytics enable on-the-job performance. I'm sure you enjoyed it as much as I did. If you have any other questions, as Chris said, feel free to contact him or Nick, or you can contact us at filtered.com or tweet us at #filteredwebinar. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we would really appreciate your feedback on it. And you will also receive a follow-up email within the next 24 to 48 hours with a link to view a recording of today's webinar. On behalf of Filtered and our presenter, Chris Littlewood, thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of your day. Until the next time.